Imagine stumbling upon a forgotten cabin deep in the Montana wilderness in 1876. At first glance, it looked like any other pioneer homestead. Smoke curling from the chimney, tools stacked neatly by the door, snow piled high against the logs. But step closer, and the illusion shattered. Behind the cabin, 11 crude wooden crosses jutted from the frozen ground, each one too small for an adult. Inside, journals lined the shelves, leather-bound volumes filled not with scripture or farming notes, but with anatomical sketches of malformed children and cold, clinical records stretching back generations. This was no ordinary family scraping by in frontier hardship. This was a dynasty guarding a secret and experiment in bloodlines that blurred the line between faith and fanaticism, between survival and obsession. And the deeper you go, the more chilling the truth becomes. The Donnellys were not alone. Before we step into this dark tale, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more haunting histories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It always amazes me how this community connects across the world. Now, let's journey into the shadows of America's most secretive family experiment. The Montana Territory, in the winter of 1876, was a place that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. The mountains loomed like watchful giants, their peaks cloaked in snow so deep it swallowed whole cabins if left untended. Trails were nearly impassable, carved into narrow passages where drifts rose higher than a man's shoulders. Silence pressed on the ears like a physical weight, broken only by the crunch of boots in snow or the occasional caw of a crow carried on a brittle wind. Into this harsh expanse rode Dr. Theodore Brennan, a man whose training in Vienna and Edinburgh had taught him to believe in science above all else. Yet as he pushed forward through the biting air, urged on by a hastily scribbled note Donnelly woman in bad labor. Something wrong. Come quick, he felt an unease that textbooks had never prepared him for. By the time Brennan reached the Donnelly homestead, his breath tore ragged from his chest, and his boots were caked with ice that cracked against the cabin steps. At first glance, the dwelling looked no different from countless others dotting the wilderness. Rough-hewn logs fitted tightly together, smoke curling from the chimney, tools neatly stacked by the door. Yet even before he knocked, something in the air warned him. The silence here wasn't the silence of snow. It was heavier, as if the earth itself withheld breath. His eyes caught on the ground behind the cabin, where crude wooden crosses jutted from frozen soil. 11 of them, each disturbingly small, each identical in shape, lined in a row like soldiers at attention. The sight hollowed him. Infants, far too many, buried deliberately, regularly. When Brennan entered, the cold of the mountain wind seemed almost kinder than the scene that awaited him. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, blood, and sweat, a sickly sweetness that clung to his throat. Bridge Donnelly lay pale and trembling on a makeshift bed, her lips cracked, eyes glossy with exhaustion. Kneeling beside her was Moira, her teenage daughter, who moved with a midwife's practiced calm no child her age should possess. She dabbed her mother's brow, her voice steady, her hands already stained with blood. Near the hearth, Patrick Donnelly stood silent, his broad frame blocking the firelight, pale blue eyes fixed on Brennan in a stare that felt less like a plea for help and more like a warning. On a blood-soaked cloth at the foot of the bed lay the newborn. Brennan's heart lurched at the sight. The infant twisted weakly, its body malformed in ways he had only seen in European medical texts, limbs askew, chest sunken, jaw uneven. He bent instinctively, physician's instinct urging him to save what could be saved, but the room did not swell with panic or grief. There were no frantic prayers, no wails of despair, only silence, methodical and cold. Patrick muttered at last, almost casually, "The mountain doesn't forgive weakness. Better it end now." The words landed like stones in Brennan's chest, a doctrine rather than grief. Brennan's gaze darted to the shelves, where leather-bound journals stood in neat rows. Their spines bore years carefully inked: 1821, 1834, 1847. He reached for one, his fingers trembling, and flipped through sketches of twisted spines, drawings of infants with cleft palates, notations scrawled in English and Irish Gaelic. These were not household ledgers. These were records of human lives catalogued with chilling detachment, data in an experiment that stretched decades. Brennan's breath quickened as realization struck. The Donnellys were not victims of cruel chance. They were participants in something deliberate, something hidden in plain sight among the snow and timber. Patrick's presence loomed behind him, watching as the doctor leafed through the journals. "You see now," Patrick said, his tone almost proud. His voice carried neither sorrow nor shame, but the steady cadence of a man who had rehearsed these words his whole life. "We keep the line strong. Weakness cannot linger." Bridge moaned faintly on the bed, her pain threaded with a strange resignation. Moira, her hand still pressed against her mother's abdomen, glanced at Brennan with a fleeting expression: fear, or perhaps exhaustion, before lowering her gaze again. The doctor wanted to scream, to drag the infant into his arms, to shout that this was not God's will, but human cruelty. But the weight of the crosses outside bore down on him, silencing his protest. He remembered the trembling handwriting on the message that summoned him. Something wrong. The words were a cry for help. Yes, but not from Patrick. Perhaps from Moira. Perhaps from Bridge. Someone inside this cabin had dared to break the silence of tradition, even if only in desperation. The realization chilled him. Not all of them were devoted to this creed. Some were trapped within it, prisoners of blood and obedience. The snow hammered against the walls, rattling the shutters as if the mountain itself demanded witness. Brennan steadied himself, forcing his mind into clinical clarity. He cleaned his instruments, tried to tend to Bridge, offered broth to keep her strength. But his eyes kept sliding toward the journals, the symbols of an obsession that had traveled oceans. He thought of Vienna, where men argued over heredity, of Edinburgh's lecture halls echoing with theories of selective breeding. Those were ideas confined to paper, to debate among scholars. Here, in this remote cabin, he saw them made flesh, carried out with fanatic devotion. That night, Brennan sat by the fire as the wind howled, his notes scribbled in his own journal. He wrote not just of Bridge's failing strength, or the malformed child gasping for breath, but of the orderliness of the crosses, the eerie composure of the children, the measured silence that filled the room. He noted Seamus's stutter, Colleen's two steady hands, Declan's wide eyes that seemed always on the verge of tears. These were children shaped not by chance, but by ritual trained into silence, pressed into roles that felt more like disciples than offspring. The hours dragged. Bridge faded in and out of consciousness, her moans punctuating the oppressive quiet. Moira dozed against her mother's side, her face streaked with exhaustion. Yet even in sleep, her hands twitched as if still assisting. Patrick sat rigid, his gaze distant, muttering lines of scripture twisted into justifications. Brennan felt as though he had stepped not into a home, but into a chapel of shadows, where every birth was a sermon, every grave a hymn. His rational mind screamed to leave, yet something anchored him there, a duty, perhaps, or a morbid compulsion to see how deep this darkness ran. At dawn, Brennan stepped outside, the cold air biting his lungs, the snow blinding under the weak sun. He walked toward the crosses, each one marked by careful hands, none leaning, none neglected. Knelt before them, brushing frost from the wood, tracing the grooves carved with uniform precision. These were not memorials to children mourned. These were records, entries in a ledger written in soil and wood. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Patrick's voice carried softly, almost reverently. The weak return to God, the strong carry the line forward. That is mercy, Doctor. Brennan closed his eyes, the words ringing like a curse. The day passed in uneasy rhythm. Brennan fed Bridge what little she could swallow, cleaned her wounds, and urged rest. Yet even as he performed the tasks of a physician, his thoughts churned. He imagined the generations before Fergus Donnelly in Ireland, arranging cousin marriages, cloaking obsession in scripture. He pictured the voyage across the Atlantic, crates of journals hidden beneath false stories. He thought of Ellis Island, of weary inspectors distracted, of bribes slipped into tired hands. Each step, each decision, had led to this valley, to this cabin, to this moment where he, Theodore Brennan, was the lone outsider staring into a secret older than Montana itself. That evening, he confronted Patrick directly. "These children, you write of them as though they are experiments, not lives." Patrick's eyes narrowed, but he did not flinch. "They are both," he replied calmly. "Lives given by God and lessons for those who come after. We do not weep for what is weak. We record, we remember, and we move forward." Brennan's stomach twisted. He thought of Bridges trembling, of Moira's forced composure, of the graves lined in cold symmetry. He thought of the malformed infant struggling on the cloth, its breath shallow, its fate already decided. The night grew long. Brennan remained awake, his quill scratching furiously in his journal, capturing every detail, every word, every expression, every ritual. He knew now that this was not mere survival, twisted by hardship. It was a creed, a system of belief, carried like a torch through generations. The Donnellys were not simply enduring the wilderness. They were conducting an experiment upon it, upon themselves, upon the very notion of life. And as the storm raged outside, Brennan realized the true horror had only begun to unfold. By the third day, Bridges' condition worsened. Fever burned her skin, her breaths shallow, sweat soaking the bedding. Brennan worked tirelessly, mixing remedies, cooling her brow, whispering reassurances, though his voice felt hollow against the weight of Patrick's unyielding faith. At last, as dusk fell, Bridges' eyes fluttered open, locking onto Brennan's with startling clarity. Her lips parted, her voice a rasp. "Save them if you can." Then her eyes slid shut again. Brennan froze, those words searing into his mind. She had not begged for her own life. She had begged for the children. That night, when the cabin fell silent and Patrick finally retreated to his corner, Brennan turned again to the journals. By candlelight, he traced sketches, read entries spanning half a century. Each page confirmed what he feared: a family not cursed, but devoted, shaping their lineage with deliberate cruelty. The weak called, the strong recorded, all under the guise of faith. His hand trembled as he wrote his own words. "This is no accident. This is design." He felt both dread and a strange compulsion. He was not merely a doctor tending to a birth gone wrong. He was a witness to something monstrous, something that demanded to be seen, to be known. When dawn broke again, the storm finally eased, leaving the world outside blanketed in a deceptive calm. Brennan stepped into the snow, staring once more at the line of crosses. His breath hung in the cold air as he whispered to himself, "Not cursed, chosen." The words frightened him because he realized that it was precisely how Patrick saw it. Behind him, the cabin creaked, the fire crackled, and somewhere within those walls, another journal waited for its next entry. Brennan's journey had brought him here as a doctor, but he would leave, if he could leave at all, as something else entirely. A keeper of knowledge that might damn or save generations to come. The story of the Donnelly family did not begin in the Montana wilderness, nor even in America. Its roots reached back to the misty green hills of County Cork, Ireland, in the late 1700s. This was a land pressed under the weight of famine, disease, and crushing poverty, where faith and kinship were often the only shields against despair. Villages clung to survival like moss to stone, each season a battle, each child born a fragile victory. Yet among these scattered communities, one family began to whisper a doctrine not of endurance, but of obsession. The Donnellys, led by a farmer named Fergus, turned their gaze inward, convinced that blood itself could be perfected like seed corn or cattle stock. Fergus Donnelly was not an uneducated man, though he wore the coarse garments of a farmer. He read scripture with sharp eyes, recited passages of the Old Testament with a scholar's cadence, and spoke of ancient patriarchs as though he had sat beside them. Neighbors dismissed his talk at first as eccentricity, yet his conviction only grew stronger. He declared that just as cattle were bred for muscle and sheep for wool, so too could men be bred for strength of body and brilliance of mind. He claimed God had given his family a gift, pale eyes like glass, angular features, quick intelligence, and it was their duty to preserve it unspoiled. The whispers began when Fergus arranged marriages not with neighboring families, but within his own blood. Cousins to cousins, sisters' sons to brothers' daughters. In rural Ireland, where famine and British oppression left little choice, cousin marriages were not unheard of. But Fergus carried it further, cloaking his schemes in biblical justifications. He cited Abraham and Sarah, Lot's daughters, stories where kin mingled with kin to carry God's promise forward. To him, this was not sin but sanctity. Father Cillian O'Sullivan, the parish priest, confronted him once in the rectory, warning, "You tempt God's wrath, Fergus. To twist his words, so is to invite ruin." Fergus only smiled and answered, "God gave us strong seed. Would you have us scatter it among the weak?" For a time, the results seemed to prove him right. The Donnelly children were striking, tall and angular, their pale eyes unsettling in their intensity. One daughter could memorize sermons after a single hearing. Another son calculated sums faster than his teacher. Villagers muttered that the Donnellys were touched by a gift, perhaps even by God. Mothers envied the family's cleverness. Fathers admired their vigor. But behind closed doors, the truth festered. For every brilliant child born, another came twisted or frail, gasping only minutes before slipping into silence. These infants disappeared quietly, their deaths explained as fevers or God's mysterious will. Few asked questions, but many noticed how the small family graveyard grew with disturbing regularity. By 1798, tragedy collided with scandal. Father O'Sullivan, older now and sterner in his faith, stumbled upon what he could no longer ignore. He saw Donnelly women bearing children with alarming frequency, yet only a fraction survived infancy. He confronted Fergus in the sacristy late one night, demanding answers. What he received was not apology, but confession spoken with pride. Fergus admitted he was building a bloodline without weakness, recording each birth, each death, in a leather-bound journal. Horrified, O'Sullivan denounced the family from the pulpit, calling them an abomination before God. His words rippled through the parish, but famine and rebellion distracted the villagers. The scandal dissolved into whispers, and the Donnellys locked their journals tighter. What should have broken them instead hardened into tradition. Cousins married cousins. Secrets were passed down like heirlooms, whispered on winter nights by candlelight. Children were raised not just to work the fields, but to carry the doctrine. Keep the line strong, prune away the weak. Fergus aged into a patriarch whose word was law, his journals thickening with sketches and notations in Irish Gaelic. To outsiders, the Donnellys remained curious but unremarkable, a family of sharp minds and cruel luck. To themselves, they were pioneers of a grim experiment, convinced that their suffering was the price for a perfected future. When Fergus died, his son Lorcan took the creed as inheritance. Lorcan was harder, colder, less concerned with appearances. He expanded the journals, adding symbols, measurements, even drawings of skulls and spines. Under his rule, the family graveyard grew larger still, its crosses multiplying like weeds. The parishioners avoided their homestead, crossing themselves when passing by. Yet no one intervened. In an Ireland fractured by poverty and rebellion, one family's strange practices seemed small against the backdrop of empire. Still, whispers lingered. The Donnellys were cursed, touched by brilliance and madness alike. By the mid-1800s, the weight of suspicion had grown heavy. Neighbors dared not speak openly, but parish records told their own story. Too many cousin marriages, too many infant burials, too many late-night arguments spilling out of the rectory. The final blow came when Father O'Sullivan discovered one of the family's hidden journals. He turned its pages by candlelight, his hands trembling as he saw drawings of malformed infants, notes about acceptable traits, and chilling references to God's testing fire. This time, the priest could not stay silent. He threatened excommunication unless the family ceased their practices or left Ireland altogether. Patrick Donnelly, grandson of Fergus, knew the family's survival depended on escape. Within weeks, they sold off land, gathered their hidden gold, and prepared to vanish. They chose America not for opportunity, but for obscurity. Across the Atlantic, no one knew their reputation. Across the Atlantic, the graves would be forgotten, and the journals could be continued in secrecy. The voyage of 1874 was crowded and miserable. Decks packed with coughing children, the smell of sickness thick in the air, hope and desperation mingling like smoke. But the Donnellys did not mingle. They kept apart, their children pale-eyed and silent, their crates heavy with something more precious than food journals, heirlooms, and a creed they had sworn never to abandon. At Ellis Island, suspicion stirred. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a weary inspector, noted the family's odd uniformity, the children's pale eyes, their stiff answers, the peculiar resemblance between them. His report flagged possible hereditary abnormalities and recommended detention for further review. Yet the Donnellys slipped through. Paperwork was shuffled in the chaos. Pockets were padded with gold, and the family vanished into the streets of New York. Officially, they remained in Brooklyn for 3 years. In truth, they were shadows, leaving no parish records, no neighbors who remembered them. By the time officials searched again, the Donnellys were gone. The Montana Territory promised what Ireland and New York could not: distance. When Patrick arrived with his wife Bridge and their 4 surviving children, they carried themselves not as desperate immigrants, but as people used to hiding in plain sight. In Helena, Patrick claimed to be a potato farmer, yet his hands were soft, ink-stained, betraying another life. He purchased 160 acres of remote land with gold coins, raising few eyebrows in a mining region where fortunes were often carried in metal. The land he chose was nestled in steep ridges, snowbound for months of the year. To most settlers, isolation spelled doom. To the Donnellys, it meant safety. Their cabin rose by autumn, sturdier than most, with sealed partitions and hidden storage. Neighbors described Bridge as haunted, her voice soft, her eyes darting nervously as though she expected discovery at every turn. The children spoke politely, but strangely, slipping into Irish Gaelic when they thought no one could hear. And Patrick's story never wavered. They were simple folk chasing a better life. Yet those who met them left unsettled, a feeling they couldn't quite put into words. Behind their careful smiles and scripted words, something darker waited, something that had crossed the ocean with them. At first, their new life in Montana appeared enviable. The cabin was solid, the garden neatly ordered, supplies rationed with precision. But when neighbors glimpsed more closely, unease stirred. Seamus, Moira, Colleen, and Declan looked almost too alike, their features a mirror of each other. They moved with eerie synchronicity, as if rehearsed. Conversations carried unsettling phrases. Keep the line strong. Watch for the signs. The weak mustn't linger. Even the youngest, Declan, repeated such words, parroting a creed he could not possibly understand. These were not children raised in freedom, but disciples in training. Strangers left the cabin with a chill clinging to them. The Donnelly children's competence felt unnatural: girls preserving meat with mathematical care, boys repairing tools with inventive precision. These were skills beyond their years, taught not for survival alone, but for a mission hidden beneath daily chores. And always, behind the cabin, the crosses multiplied. To outsiders, it was tragedy. To the Donnellys, it was record-keeping. A ritual dressed in prayer, yet rooted in something colder. By the spring thaw of 1875, those crosses had grown in number, their symmetry unmistakable. It was no longer misfortune. It was a pattern. By then, word had begun to spread. Traders spoke of the family's strangeness, of the aura that lingered in their valley. Some brushed it off as gossip. But for men like Jake Harrison, the mail carrier, the truth was harder to ignore. He had heard their chants through the cracks of the door, seen the identical crosses behind the house, smelled the sickly sweetness of fresh graves in the snow. He carried those whispers to Dr. Brennan, setting into motion the chain of events that would lead to the cabin in 1876 and to the horror that even death could not fully bury. The first winter that Donnellys spent in Montana sealed them off from the world like prisoners in their own design. Snow drifts blocked the narrow passes, and neighbors who might have checked in were forced to stay away. For most frontier families, such isolation meant danger, starvation, disease, or madness. But for the Donnellys, it meant freedom. Inside their cabin, rules dictated every breath. Patrick's voice rarely rose, but it never needed to. His children responded to the smallest glance, a twitch of his hand, as though the cost of disobedience had been carved into their bones. Meals were eaten in silence, broken only by muttered prayers and the scrape of wooden spoons. The fire's glow flickered across faces too pale for children raised in the outdoors, eyes glassy with secrets no outsiders could imagine. When the thaw finally came, neighbors who braved the trail noticed changes they couldn't explain. Bridge, gaunt and hollow-eyed, no longer looked like the woman who had arrived a year earlier. Moira and Colleen moved with the weary grace of women twice their age, shadows under their eyes betraying sleepless nights. Seamus stuttered more violently than before, words catching in his throat as if fear itself tightened his tongue. And little Declan, barely 12, stared at the crosses behind the cabin with something that looked like dread. Visitors whispered later that this was not the look of a family hardened by frontier misfortune, but of one bound by something unnatural. Jake Harrison, the mail carrier, was among the first to feel it in his gut. One morning, arriving earlier than expected, he paused outside the door and heard voices inside. Not English, but Irish Gaelic, the tones sharp and rhythmic, like judgment being passed. Then, in English, a phrase that froze him. The blood must not weaken. The others didn't survive. God favors the strong. Harrison stepped back, his breath catching, and left the letters undelivered. Later, he told himself it had been a misunderstanding, words twisted by fear. But he never shook the sound of those voices, calm as priests conducting a ritual. By the following spring, fresh graves appeared behind the cabin. 4 new crosses, identical to the rest, planted with mathematical precision. Harrison felt his stomach turn when he saw them. These were not the haphazard markers of grief-stricken parents, but the careful symbols of the system. When he asked Patrick, the man's reply chilled him further. "The weak don't survive out here," Patrick said, his tone firm, tinged with the certainty of faith. "Better they rest with God than suffer." He spoke of mercy, but his eyes were hard, and Harrison left with the sense that the man wasn't talking about accidents or illness. He was describing policy. Declan was the only one who betrayed the weight of doubt. One afternoon, as Harrison handed him a parcel, the boy whispered, "Father says it's God's will, but sometimes I don't think it's God deciding." His eyes darted toward the cabin, wide with terror, before he clamped his lips shut. He never spoke another word of it, but Harrison carried those whispers like a splinter under the skin. Each new cross behind the cabin seemed to confirm what he feared. that this was no tragedy of nature, but the continuation of something older and darker. It was Harrison who finally carried his unease to Dr. Theodore Brennan in Helena. The doctor listened with growing alarm as the mail carrier recounted the strange lights glowing at odd hours, the ghostly songs that floated over the snow, the uniform rows of graves. Brennan was no ordinary country physician. His training in Vienna and Berlin had exposed him to the latest theories of heredity, whispers of selective breeding, and the grim mathematics of bloodlines. As Harrison spoke, the doctor felt his instincts blaze to life. What he heard was not misfortune. It was a pattern, and patterns demanded explanation. That winter, trapped by weather, Brennan turned to records. He combed through immigration files, parish registries from Ireland, and Ellis Island medical notes. What he found tightened the knot in his chest. The Donnellys' papers placed them in Brooklyn for 3 years, but no census confirmed it. The farms they supposedly lost in Ireland did not exist in land records. Even their claimed relatives were ghosts, vanishing into thin air. The most damning were Dr. Samuel Morrison's notes from Ellis Island, flagging hereditary irregularities among the children, recommending detention that never occurred. The Donnellys had slipped through, leaving only suspicion in their wake. Other whispers surfaced, scattered across the states. In Pennsylvania, a Donnelly family lost 4 infants in a single year. In Ohio, another branch was investigated for neglect, only to vanish overnight. Each account carried echoes of the same story: cousin marriages, infant graves, secrecy cloaked in prayer. Brennan began to suspect the Montana family was not an anomaly, but simply the latest outpost of a creed transplanted from Ireland, seeded across America like a contagion. His hands trembled as he sketched theories in his journal. Was this not simply bad luck, but a deliberate pursuit of genetic purity? Were these families culling their children in the name of strength? As spring approached, Brennan resolved he could no longer remain in the safety of speculation. The evidence pointed not to tragedy, but to intention, and intention demanded confrontation. When the snow began to melt, he packed his satchel with instruments, journals, and a determination that burned sharper than fear. The summons arrived sooner than he expected. A trapper pounding on his door, breathless and pale, clutching a scrap of paper. Donnelly woman in bad labor. Something wrong. Come quick. For the first time, the Donnellys had asked for help. Brennan knew instantly it meant catastrophe within their walls. The journey to the homestead tested every ounce of his resolve. The trail was slick with thawing ice, the air thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. By the time he reached the cabin, sweat clung to his skin despite the cold. What greeted him inside was chaos wrapped in eerie order. Moira writhed on a bed in the back room, her face twisted in agony. Beside her, Colleen moved with the calm precision of a practiced assistant, her hands already preparing cloths and water. Patrick and Bridge stood silent, their pale eyes fixed on the doctor not with desperation, but calculation. Brennan understood at once. Moira was delivering twins, but not ordinary twins. They were joined at the torso, their cries ragged and unnatural, one stronger than the other, both struggling for breath. His medical training told him survival was impossible, separation futile. Yet what struck him most was not the deformity, but the family's response. No panic, no grief. Journals already lay open on the table, quills ready for notes. Instruments had been laid out not only for birth, but for dissection. Brennan felt his stomach churn. This was not tragedy to them. This was documentation. He worked through the night, not because he believed he could save the children, but because his oath demanded it. Yet as he labored, he realized their fate had already been sealed by a code older than Montana itself. Patrick hovered close, muttering, "Weakness cannot be allowed to poison the line." Bridge, trembling, added softly, "Mercy, doctor. It is mercy." Their words were not cruelty in their minds, but duty. Brennan felt himself standing in a laboratory of flesh, a place where faith and obsession had fused into something monstrous. For 3 days the twins clung to life, their breaths shallow and pained. Brennan did what he could, but each hour confirmed the inevitable. When the infants finally succumbed, the cabin fell into stillness. Moira's sobs echoed briefly before she silenced herself, biting her lips until they bled. Patrick closed the journal with grim finality, as though another chapter had ended. Brennan stared at the fire, his body trembling, knowing he had not merely witnessed a death. He had witnessed the continuation of a creed that stretched back generations, now carried forward in ink, in ritual, in silence. That night, Patrick invited Brennan outside. The air was cold, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Patrick's voice was low, steady, rehearsed like scripture. He spoke of Fergus Donnelly, of Ireland, of the belief that blood could be purified through sacrifice. He admitted openly that he and Bridge were cousins, as were their parents before them. "Our line is chosen," he said, eyes fixed on the crosses beyond the cabin. "God gives us strength, but he also tests us. The weak are not meant to live. To spare them is mercy. To preserve the strong is duty." Brennan felt his stomach turn as the words sank in. This man did not see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a steward. Inside, the journals confirmed every word. Pages filled with drawings, notations, records of births and deaths across decades and across oceans. They spoke not only of Montana, but of Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York are their branches, other graves. Some children celebrated for their intellect or beauty, others returned to God. Brennan closed the covers with shaking hands, realizing he was not standing in a house, but in the heart of a network, a system of obsession stretching far beyond one family. He was both horrified and strangely awed, for in front of him was human eugenics decades before science had even given it a name. When Dr. Theodore Brennan left the Donnelly cabin after the death of the conjoined twins, he carried more than his satchel and weary body down the mountain trail. He carried knowledge records of practices so grotesque they blurred the line between medicine and heresy. For weeks he wrote feverishly, filling his journals with observations, the identical crosses, the uniform graves, the eerie silence of the children. Each line weighed heavier on him, for he knew that to remain silent was to become complicit. The family had built a fortress of secrecy, but secrecy, once pierced, could never be fully restored. Brennan's report reached territorial officials by the early summer of 1876. Hardened men who had seen death on the frontier sat stunned as they read his testimony. The Donnelly's journals fragments he had managed to copy and haste-described births, cataloged as if they were livestock, deformities sketched with cold precision, children marked as viable or released. For Brennan, these were not the ravings of superstition. They were evidence of systematic infanticide, cloaked in ritual and faith. The officials hesitated, unsure whether to treat it as madness, crime, or something more dangerous. Yet the weight of his medical authority tipped the scales. An investigation was ordered. Federal marshals rode with Brennan back into the valley, their horses straining on the treacherous trail. They expected hostility, perhaps a barricaded cabin or rifles leveled from the windows. Instead, they found something stranger, a family splintering under its own weight. Patrick tried to maintain his stern composure, but his once commanding voice faltered when he saw the badges. Bridge, gaunt and hollow-eyed, muttered prayers under her breath, rocking back and forth as though bargaining with unseen forces. The children looked like shadows of themselves, Moira visibly pregnant, Colleen stiff and silent, Seamus trembling so violently he could barely speak, and Declan, the youngest, staring with hollow defiance that barely masked terror. The marshals swept the property, guided by Brennan's insistence. Behind the cabin, they began to exhume the graves. One by one, the tiny coffins were unearthed, each containing infants twisted by deformities, cleft palates, clubbed feet, misshapen skulls, limbs bent at impossible angles. Brennan's stomach turned as he confirmed what he already knew. These were not the random tragedies of frontier life. These were the predictable results of deliberate inbreeding, compounded generation after generation. Each grave was a ledger entry in wood and soil, and now the world was forced to confront them. The journals provided damning corroboration. Written in Patrick's careful hand, they cataloged each birth, each death, each justification. Some infants described as blessed with clarity or strength to endure. Others labeled unfit or returned to God. The marshals read in silence, their faces hardened, their knuckles whitening on the pages. For the first time, the Donnellys' creed was dragged into daylight, and what the family called mercy, others named murder. Patrick's composure collapsed in custody. At first, he thundered with defiance, proclaiming himself the guardian of a sacred bloodline, chosen to withstand the weakness of the world. But as days turned to weeks, he broke into trembling fits, alternating between manic pride and tearful confession. He admitted he had buried more children than he could remember, that each grave carved his soul, yet also reaffirmed his duty. Bridge fared no better. Her mind, already frayed, shattered under questioning. She raved about spirits and curses, about God's test and the burden of sacrifice. Both died before their trial could conclude Patrick of a sudden stroke, Bridge from complications of yet another stillbirth. Their deaths closed the chapter on their leadership, but left their children adrift in a world they had been raised to fear. For Seamus, the collapse was final. His stutter worsened until words abandoned him entirely. He sat in silence, staring at walls, trembling at every shadow. In time, he was institutionalized in Helena, his mind fractured by years of dread and obedience. Moira and Colleen, conditioned since birth to see themselves as vessels for continuation of the line, carried scars no court could measure. Moira's pregnancy marked her as both victim and participant, her silence a shield against further judgment. Colleen's eyes grew hollow, her hands clenched perpetually, as if bracing for blows that might never come. Declan, the boy whose whispered doubts had cracked the family's armor, vanished before any judgment could be passed. One night he slipped from custody, disappearing into the wilderness. Whether he perished in the mountains or survived to carry fragments of his family's creed elsewhere, no one ever knew. The Donnelly experiment had ended, yet its echoes remained. In the years that followed, the abandoned homestead stood as a monument to suffering. Locals avoided the valley, claiming the ground itself was heavy with grief. Hunters swore they heard crying in the night, though the cabin sagged into ruin, its timbers creaking against the wind. But the graveyard remained disturbingly intact. 11 crosses, identical and symmetrical, as though the family's doctrine had carved itself permanently into the soil. Travelers who stumbled upon the site turned back immediately, unsettled not by the presence of tragedy, but by the orderliness of it. This was not grief etched in wood. This was ritual. For Brennan, the case became both landmark and torment. In public reports, he spoke clinically of inbreeding and its genetic consequences. His words quietly influenced early American debates about heredity, shaping the groundwork for what would later become the science of genetics. But in his private journals, he wrote with anguish. He confessed to recurring nightmares, the ragged cries of the twins, Patrick's unwavering gaze, Declan's whispered words. Sometimes I don't think it's God deciding. He feared that by documenting their story, he had preserved not only evidence, but a blueprint others might one day follow. In the decades that followed, whispers of similar families surfaced. Reports from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other immigrant communities hinted at uncanny similarities: cousin marriages, high infant mortality, clusters of graves too uniform to be accidents. Some investigators noted the parallels to Montana. Others dismissed them as folklore, the kind of tales rural communities spin around tragedy. But the echoes refused to fade. Were these coincidences, or proof that the Donnellys were not alone, that their creed had spread like a shadow across America. The legacy of the Donnellys seeped quietly into law and policy. Debates over cousin marriage, once framed as moral questions, began to include medical reasoning. Child welfare laws gained sharper teeth, granting governments authority to investigate insular families in remote communities. Slowly, the grim lesson of Montana took hold, that secrecy and isolation could mask generational harm, and that children were not mere extensions of bloodlines, but individuals deserving protection. The Donnelly story became a caution whispered in medical schools and legal chambers alike, a reminder of how obsession with purity corrodes compassion. And yet, even as their graves weathered under snow and wind, questions lingered. Did Declan survive, carrying pieces of his family's creed into adulthood? Did other branches across America continue their grim rituals unseen? Or was Montana the final gasp of a delusion too monstrous to endure? No one could say. But one truth remained inescapable. The pursuit of perfection, unmoored from humanity, leads not to strength, but to ruin. The Donnelly legacy was not the superior bloodline they dreamed of. It was a warning carved into history, stretching from the hills of Ireland to the frozen valleys of Montana. Dr. Brennan lived out his days burdened by that warning. In his final journal entry, discovered after his death, he wrote, "I fear the greatest danger is not what the Donnellys did in secret, but that their logic might one day seem reasonable to men in power. For cruelty dressed as duty always finds new soil to root itself in." His words proved prophetic, for in the century to come, the world would witness governments and scientists repeating those same mistakes on a scale far greater than a single family. But the Donnellys remained their own haunting chapter, a reminder that obsession, once sanctified by faith, can turn a hearth into a laboratory and a family into an experiment. In the end, the Montana cabin crumbled, its roof sagging until it collapsed under snow. The journals were locked away, some lost, some preserved in archives few dared to read. The crosses rotted slowly, falling one by one into the earth, yet their memory endured. For those who dared to speak of it, the Donnelly story was not simply history. It was a shadow-stretching, shifting, and whispering from the past that asked a question more chilling than any answer. How many others, hidden in valleys and behind closed doors, might have carried out their own experiments in silence?